Welcome to everyone, both here in The Hague and around the world on Zoom, and many people taking part on YouTube. I'm talking to you from the World Justice Forum. I think the leading global gathering of those working to advance the rule of law and deliver people-centered justice for all. And we've had a very inspiring week already at the forum. It's been a very active week. We've seen the Justice Action Coalition, a network of governments, of partners from all sectors, uniting behind a justice appeal that aims to accelerate action to close the justice gap ahead of the second Sustainable Development Goals Summit in 2023. They have really pressed the accelerator on action on justice for all. And the unmet demand for justice is absolutely massive. We have roughly 1.5 billion people experiencing justice problems that they cannot resolve, and many billions of people also facing systematic patterns of discrimination, abuse, and injustice. So a massive task ahead of us. Today's session focuses on the role of young people as leaders for justice, the need that young people have for justice themselves in their lives, in their communities, in their societies, and the intergenerational nature of the fight for justice. Half the world's population is under the age of 30, and we can expect around 11 billion more people to be born this century, more than are currently alive. So unless we design justice systems that work for young people, unless we prepare justice systems that are ready for the justice seekers of the future, we really will not be doing our job. Children and young people have very distinctive justice needs. They also have increased vulnerability to injustice, especially when they are very young and cannot speak so easily for themselves. And as they get older, they're increasingly on the front line as our justice providers. So at all levels, the need for justice, the need for a focus on justice for young people is incredibly strong. Last year, from the UN Secretary General, we saw a report on the future of international cooperation called Our Common Agenda. And in that report, he made it clear that he believed that people-centered justice was absolutely fundamental to reimagining the social contract in our societies and to building more just relations between countries. These are urgent challenges at a time when the world is under extreme pressure. He also asked my organization, the UN Foundation, to provide a platform for young people to contribute to his thinking. And as part of that work, Elisa Jimenez, then part of the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, and now at the Center for Policing Equity, brought together a group of young justice experts and practitioners to provide the Secretary General with ideas and suggest recommendations. They argued that providing justice for young people is one of the transformative shifts that we need to unleash the power of a new generation. And from their work emerged the idea of forming the Young Justice Leaders to bring together leaders who happen to be young and who are working for justice. Today's session formally launches that group, the Young Justice Leaders, as an entity and as a fundamental part of the Justice Action Coalition. And we're going to hear directly from Elisa in a few minutes about the origins of the group. On the slides in a couple of minutes, you're going to see the members of the Young Justice Leaders, a fantastic group from across the world, and you'll be able to read their biographies in the link I think somebody is placing in chat. Here in The Hague, though, we're proud to have two of the Young Justice Leaders with us. I would like to introduce on my left, Vino Lucero, a journalist and freedom of information advocate from the Philippines, who works to promote digital rights and data justice and to defend and expand and create civic space. Vino is from the Philippines, but he's working both regionally and globally. Welcome, Vino. I would also like to welcome Shaneel Lal, a campaigner who has helped end conversion therapy in New Zealand, a massive campaigning achievement, and a writer, creator, researcher, political commentator, and model with expertise in areas that include queer and Indigenous rights issues. Welcome, Shaneel. And then we are also incredibly honored to have one of the world's leading champions of intergenerational justice join our panel. Mary Robinson is the former president of Ireland, a former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and very much a current champion for gender equality, peace building, climate justice, and the rights of future generations. Mary is here in her capacity as an elder and as chair of the elders. Welcome, Mary. As I said, we're going to start today's session with Elisa. Elisa, I think you're going to be appearing on the screen. So thanks so much for being one of the many people who are joining us online today. Lisa, if you can hear me, I wonder if you could give us a flavor of how you and the other young justice leaders took the initiative to form this group and what role you hope the justice leaders can achieve ahead of the SDG Summit in 2023. Lisa, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, David. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm just be here virtually. And I'm just really happy to be able to share the same space as many of the other individuals that you just mentioned. So thank you again. So as David mentioned, I was previously with the Pathfinders, and I was working on the justice team. And as a relatively young person myself, a big element of the work that I was doing was identifying other individuals in the space who were change makers. And no surprise to many of the people on this call, a lot of them were young. And a lot of these discussions that we were hearing around the 2020, around the agenda and the lead up to 2030, as well as conversations around how to really catalyze true change and what people-centered justice look like. A lot of those examples were coming from leaders on the ground who were also young. And in the summer of 2021 and in the fall, there was a report that David's organization just mentioned, UN Foundation, which was run by the UN Foundation Next Generation Fellows. And this report titled Our Future Agenda, it was written by young people who are leaders in their respective fields. And this report, which was commissioned and specifically asked for by the UN Secretary General in their office, it articulated the need for people-centered justice as critical to achieving essentially anything. It's a key unlocker, such as many other elements, such as education, too. And while this may not have been a large surprise to many of the people working on the ground, of course, it did serve as a really important moment in a space that typically did not elevate the voices of young people in ways that were as effective as previous that could have been as effective. And this report and the access that this report demonstrated, what that said to people in the larger SDG community was, this is the time. This is the moment to seize this opportunity where young people have truly been given authentic opportunities for engagement. And, truly just in conversations with a lot of my colleagues and in a lot of the other spaces that I had the opportunity to be a part of, individuals were talking and discussing how to mobilize around this opportunity that we were seeing that was coming out and being symbolized by this report that I just mentioned. And in a lot of conversations, what really came up was how to bring individuals together around justice and people-centered justice. So no surprise, as I was working with the Pathfinders for Justice group. And it's really what came out of that discussion was, in the true nature of what Pathfinders does in a lot of these spaces, was serve as a convener. And what ultimately was discussed and what was decided upon was the true need to ensure that there was a space for young leaders who were implementing people-centered justice and really answering the question of how to improve people's lives related to justice, whether that was working to end conversion therapy in New Zealand, that the example that David just mentioned that Shaneel led, or the work around privacy and freedom of press that Vino and other members of the Young Justice Leaders has led, and how to get this group of people together to ensure that they are given the opportunity to speak and to be connected to other people in the larger SDG space. Brilliant. And I think, exactly. And I just want to emphasize that these people were all leaders in their own right already. And this was really an exciting opportunity for us to come together and provide that space for them just to amplify the work they were already doing.
So thanks, Elisa. Huge congratulations on the work that you've done to make this happen. And now we're going to hear from a couple of the justice leaders about the practicalities of their work. So Vino, you've heard from Elisa. She said that justice is the key unlocker. She's also said that this is the time. You were selected from a large cohort to be one of the young justice leaders. What do you think you bring to the group, and what are you hoping to achieve by having this global platform?
Thanks for that question, David. For me, working as an investigative journalist and now as somebody who's doing work around the topic of digital safety and internet freedom in South and Southeast Asia, I definitely worked alongside representatives of marginalized communities, those experiencing injustice on the ground. So I want to use this platform to actually amplify their voices so that this global audience can learn more about what they're experiencing, what it's like to be living their life through their perspectives. So I want to use this to highlight that, and then at the same time, use my learnings working alongside representatives of these marginalized communities to create this vision of how I want to contribute in improving the situation on the ground in the grassroots, and as well as doing policy advocacy work. Take, for example, I want to use that vision and use this Young Justice Leaders program opportunity to actually implement those, put effort in those work. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And let me then turn to you, Shaneel. I mean, you're in your early 20s, you've already achieved significant campaigning success that's led to real change in the justice system in your own country. How do you plan to use this global platform? Where next for you as a young justice leader?
Kia ora koutou katoa. I greet you in the language of the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am Shaneel, and I'm one of 7 young justice leaders, as you said. I was born in Fiji, a colonized Christian island nation. And I grew up in Fiji in a time where homosexuality was criminalized and the practice of praying the gay away was rampant. So for me, growing up in Fiji, accessing justice was never an option. I moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand when I was 14 years old, but I left behind the people that I loved who were queer, just like me. And many Pacific Islands, including Samoa and Tonga and the Cook Islands, still criminalize homosexuality. And that gives rise to the question, how do you get justice when the systems built to provide you with justice deem you a criminal for simply existing? The Pacific Islands are isolated from the world, but unfortunately, the British colonizers found us anyway. The global community, or synonymously known as the international community, has conveniently overlooked and ignored the human rights crisis in the Pacific. I joined the Young Justice Leaders because I wanted to amplify the voices of people that have been neglected by the global North. And I hope that through conversations like this, we will achieve that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So turning to you, former President Robinson, in recent years, the elders have made a huge commitment to people-centered justice, with your fellow elder Hina Jilani co-chairing the Task Force on Justice that launched its findings here at the World Justice Forum 3 years ago. And since then, the elders have focused on closing the justice gap for women, and have also been at the forefront of driving implementation on all of the justice targets that we find in the SDGs. I've had the honor of seeing you advocate for that within the United Nations in New York. Given the elders' commitment to intergenerational dialogue and action, how do you react to what you've heard from the young justice leaders? And what do you take from the commitment of Elisa, Vino, Shaneel, and other members of the group?
Well, I'm very happy to be present at what I understand is actually the launch of this Young Justice Leaders, because, as you mentioned, the elders are very keen on the intergenerational dialogue. That dialogue has changed since I was growing up. I had a beloved grandfather who was a retired lawyer because of ill health, and he didn't know how to speak to a child. So he spoke to a 10-year-old, 11-year-old girl who couldn't get enough of this grown-up conversation about justice. And then I would go back and my brothers would treat me as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old. But it was the oxygen of being recognized as a child for intelligent conversation. And it brings out, that we need to go not just to young justice leaders, but children's rights in this context as well. But the elders, we work very closely with young climate activists, and we learn so much from them. As I learned this morning from talking to the two of you and two other colleagues, you live in a very social media connected world. You have huge outreach in what you do. So it's really important. For example, I fought against the criminalization of homosexuality in Ireland. I just know how important it is to address this in the Pacific Islands, and to be able to communicate through social media far more than I was communicating in the old days last century, but nonetheless for justice reasons. So I think the young justice group will play a very real role in the overall way in which we understand the gaps and the lack of access to justice in our world. I belong to that previous panel, the Committee on Legal Empowerment of the Poor.
Yes.
And, I was quite taken aback when we concluded that about 4 million people don't have effective access to any form of justice, use informal means of trying to combat all the burdens and discriminations, etc. And the task force came out with a worse number, 5 million. In our world today, which again was quite a shock. So we really need young people to drive this agenda, frankly, drive this agenda. Young people speak truth to power, and we need justice to be spoken about firmly, in principled ways, with data-driven, evidence, to back up the justice case.
So before we go on to hear about some of these concrete plans, I mean, Shaneel, you're campaigning for the legalization of homosexuality today. You've just heard from Mary about her work to do that in Ireland earlier in her career. How do you feel when you hear about her experience, and how do you think it's possible for elders and young justice leaders to work together in the future?
Me and Mary had a lovely conversation this morning, and we talked about this quite a bit. And I think when it comes to queer rights activism, it's such an intergenerational thing, precisely because our progress is incremental. So we didn't get to the decriminalization of homosexuality and the right to marry in the same decade. We got them over time. And I feel like fundamentally the desire for justice remains, but now it just looks different. For example, in New Zealand, we decriminalized homosexuality in the 1980s. We got the right to marry in 2013. We banned conversion therapy in 2022. Things look different, but it's the same goal: to treat people equally.
And Vino, you've heard Shaneel talking about the issue, but you're in the digital space. That's your world, and Mary has pointed out that this is really a game changer. Can you say something about both the opportunities and the risks that you see for justice in that digital space?
Definitely. So I see it that for advocates, it is another way to reach more and more people to raise awareness. But then at the same time, for advocates like me, and somebody, take for example, I am a gay non-binary journalist, and there is a different kind of attack for marginalized groups online. So I feel like while we definitely use the internet and social media to reach a lot of people, we also need to be aware about how to protect these advocates and ourselves when interacting online. So I think digital safety, take for example, is something that we can talk about across generations. So Mary mentioned that she's very interested about it, and I feel like that interest is shared by a lot of people, because everybody wants to be safe online, especially when they use social media. So yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the meat of this. It's the Justice Action Coalition, this high ambition coalition that's come together to prepare for the SDG Summit. And the young justice leaders are not just there for words. You're already thinking quite clearly about what your theory of change is, what your strategies are, how you're going to, what tactics you're going to do to what you use to take those objectives forward. Can you just give us, give our audience, both here in The Hague and online, a flavor of what you think you're going to be doing over the next year or two, and what you hope to achieve? I'll hand that over to both of you.
Yeah, definitely. So on behalf of all the Young Justice leaders, we're 7 in the group. Some of them are actually watching right now. Hey, all. So Shaneel and I are very proud to talk about some of the thematic action points that we want. First, we want to start our work with the realization that for most of the global population, their experience interacting with justice institutions and with justice, the topic of justice in general, they see it as something that is inaccessible to them, something that is for the elite, for the rich, for the privileged. And these experiences and these notions are being passed on from one generation to another. So we want to start by introducing the concept of people-centered justice, this vision of people-centered justice, to the general public, to people from all walks of life. So that will definitely take some multi-sector collaboration, especially to reach people at the grassroots, to let them know that the justice that your interaction with justice, that is not what we're aspiring for. We're aspiring for people at the center when it comes to all justice processes. And for us to be able to get there, to put people at the center, one crucial thing would be to have access to justice data. Because, you know, if people have access to justice data and information, they are able to participate more in introducing justice reform or pushing for better services related to justice or accessing justice. So some of the young justice leaders are very interested in looking at how we can contribute, working with different sectors when it comes to looking at how different countries or even regions are experiencing access to justice data in relation to the people's right to information.
Yeah, I want to talk briefly about the idea of financing justice. One of the things about justice is that it is the work to achieve justice is often done by people who need it. Resourcing justice solutions is critical to ensuring that marginalized people who are leading change are not burnt out. What we know about activists is that they are tired and no one is paying them to cry. So ensuring that justice solutions are financed is ensuring the well-being of those people. We need to create sustainable solutions and sustainable movements, and sustainable solutions are created by people who are supported. The next point is reimagining youth justice. Now, this is a broad idea, but I want to talk about the unjust criminalization of young people around the world. The generation that is currently in power have this tough on crime attitude, and what that has resulted in is the unjust criminalization of young people across the world. In New Zealand, a 16-year-old can be prosecuted for murder, but the neuroscience is absolutely clear that a young person has not fully developed till the age of 25. Criminalizing young people disrupts their well-being and their educational and employment prospects, and it traps them into a lifestyle of offending. We need to move away from this Western idea that young people are autonomous individuals and focus on the socioeconomic factors that are driving crime. If the people in power are serious that young people are the future, the least I expect them to do is keep the future out of prisons.
And then another point that we're interested in looking at would be how injustices in real life are being replicated and even magnified online. So take, for example, violations of privacy. A lot of people experience that in real life, but then at the same time, governments and big corporations, big tech basically, are also doing that to our online personas or online accounts, take for example. So we want as young justice leaders to have engage people across generations from all walks of life about their rights online. And then when it comes to how to exact accountability and justice from governments and big corporations in the case that they experience injustices in the digital space. So these thematic actions that we want to do, of course, we want to do it by collaborating with members of other generations and other sectors as well. So take, for example, we're interested in doing a national and regional level research. That will definitely take some support and some co-creation process with members of the academe, other members of civil society, even governments. So we are definitely looking forward into that. Some of us are interested in consolidating movements and creating an organization even in spaces wherein there is a need to consolidate advocates and create an institution or an organization. In Asia, take for example, we're interested in creating an organization that will promote awareness about your rights online and how to exact accountability and responsibility from governments, just in case you experience violations online.
I would say as my final point, the idea of supporting young people to have a say at the table, because what often happens is that people, adults, sit around the table and talk about our rights without us at the table. And I think this here is a good example of having young people involved in conversations about young people, because you cannot form anything for us without us.
So yeah, let's turn this back to you, Mary. I mean, you've heard some themes, you know, the focus on people-centered justice, the need for data to understand what on earth's going on out there, finance, particularly for people on the front lines who are not paid, this awful problem of how young people are criminalized. And then we've also heard some of the tactics for making that happen, including the last plea, nothing about us, without us. How do you react to this? And what advice from the elders' experience would you give for these young leaders taking their plans forward?
I'm even more excited about the young justice leaders having heard the approach, because you know, it wants to be very practical and co-create, as you mentioned, the idea that justice shouldn't be elite, but it is. It's perceived to be. It's remote. It's, you know, and it's really important that young people speak about justice in terms that other young people will hear, so that we break that barrier, and that it becomes, you know, a way of understanding that we mean a very broad people-centered social justice, not just in courts justice. We mean community justice, and that requires data. And you both mentioned that quite strongly. I love the point about often those who struggle for justice are those who need it. That's very true. You know, the human rights defenders, the desperately, and they're often very under-resourced, underfunded. But actually, the whole justice system is underfunded. That's why SDG 16 was so important. It was the most controversial, of course. I remember that very well, because I had my mandate as the special envoy on climate of the Secretary General before Paris. So I was sitting in listening to the whole SDG debate and having goal 13 on climate, but noting that goal 16 was the one that governments did not want. They did not want, and governments do not want to fund in the way they'll fund health or they'll fund education, and even, you know, the philanthropic funding, you know, all of it is far less. And yet, you know, the issue of justice is so fundamental, you know, for young people, for children, and then another very valid point, that young people should be at the table. And what I like now is not to be on so-called high-level panels. I've never been asked to be on a low-level panel, but I do get asked to be on high-level panels. And very often there's one young person asked last, running out of time, hardly, you know. More recently at the Sustainable Energy for All in Kigali, I was never on a panel with one young person. It was always at least two young people, and it makes a difference. They don't use the, you know, you get diversity, you get different points, but you get truth to power. And we heard, you know, your comments were very important, because each of them was, you know, these are points we need to be in the Justice Appeal 2023 for the SDG Summit. And I would just say, I would encourage you, be as ambitious as possible. Include as many young people, and I still mention children as possible, that, fundamentally, this is the right that opens up other rights, and I like the idea of, imagining a more just world. The world is broken at the moment. It's fragmented. There are so many problems, and having more sense of this broader people-centered justice would help us to, find a way through the common agenda to have a better world. So excited.
Yeah. So let's build on that excitement and dig into it a little bit. I mean, Mary's mentioned children a couple of times, and obviously the young justice leaders are in their 20s. You're flying around the world. You're independent. You're autonomous. You're making this stuff happen. But what is the offer of the young justice leaders to younger children? Is it something that you've thought about, the justice needs for people in a younger age group who are sometimes less able to find these platforms?
And also that important breakthrough in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that children have rights and have the right to express their rights and have the right to be at the table in an appropriate way for children. I mean, it's, we don't, the world isn't like that,
So how do you, let me turn that to you, Shaneel. How do you think the group can work for and with children?
I study law at the University of Auckland, and one of the papers that I'm currently doing is family law. And family law looks at when families break down, what happens to the children. And what we know is that when a family breaks down, when a couple decides to dissolve their marriage, the first thing they do is dissolve their marriage. The second is that they share their property. And then they talk about what happens to the children. And the problem that I often have with international law is that it says that you need to accommodate the views of children as far as it is reasonable, which means that accommodating children's views at some point becomes unreasonable. And the standard of reasonable is often used by states like the New Zealand state to exclude the views of children. People just think that accommodating the views of children is too much work, so they won't do it. I think we need to move from this idea of reasonably accommodating the voices of children to you must do it.
Okay, let me move to one of the questions. We've got a flood of questions coming online, and I do urge you, if you're watching on YouTube, taking part on Zoom, please get on the chat functions and feed questions in. Somewhere out there's a team filtering through them, and then they're popping up on my screen here. But I wanted to take one of the questions that I've heard from YouTube, from a user called Val Barnes 2001. And Val Barnes 2001 says, we have billions of people on the planet. Most of them are poor. The poor are the ones most likely to experience injustices. What is justice for the poorer people in society, and how do we make sure that they get that? Can I address that at you, Vino?
Sure, definitely. As somebody who come from poverty myself, I was just able to get through basic education by getting scholarships because I was really good at school, but my parents won't be able to afford private school if not for those discounts. So somebody coming from there and experiencing, personally interacting with justice services, take for example, for children and the youth, I think something that we can work on would be making sure that across socioeconomic sectors, there should be fairness, and then there should be everyone should be able to access services related to justice and even data, take for example, because sometimes even getting devices or getting internet connection, that is already setting people on the side. Having inaccessibility, take for example, that gives them less space, less opportunities to participate. So take for example, in conversations, maybe we can ensure that there is inclusivity there, not just within the middle class or within the elite, but also just making sure that indigenous peoples are there, marginalized communities are there, those from lower socioeconomic classes are represented and heard, and they're not tokenized. We listen to them, we value their inputs, and then we apply it and act on it.
And Mary, let me turn this back to you. You mentioned your work with the Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor. From the Task Force on Justice, we heard this challenge was quite similar to the challenge that health faced in the 1970s, when there was this drive to get health out of hospitals, which of course still matter, but get it into communities, closer to people's lives. Do you think we're making progress in getting justice into people's communities, getting it closer to the people who need it most, or are we stuck?
I think it makes a huge difference when you have a community-based access to legal services of all kinds. It really does. First of all, the whole approach is welcoming. It's a community endeavor. You know, I've seen in my own country, Ireland, I'm very supportive of community-based legal services. But you know, there's also, and that I think was a very valid point, you need to have fairness and access to the basics of, you know, health, education, etc. And then you need the information which often can come through a community-based legal services approach, and that really helps greatly, I think. Just that doesn't exist in so many places and isn't encouraged by governments, because they see that as being the start of criticism of the inequalities and the unfairnesses and the discriminations. So that makes the justice fight more important, more difficult, and that's why we haven't been making. That's why there are so many gaps, and you know, and so I think we just have to, you know, make sure that this Justice Appeal 2023 is ambitious about what needs to change very significantly and fill those gaps. And the young leaders, the young justice group, I rely upon. Truth to power. Call us out. Make sure. Don't accept that the gaps will continue after 2023, if I can put it that way. Let's get on track to fulfill Goal 16.
And Mary, when you and Hina Jelani launched the Elders' Work on Justice in Buenos Aires, I guess that was around 4 years ago. Now, you led a visit to a community justice center in one of the poorest communities in Buenos Aires. I remember 3 of the young women who were working there and how inspiring they were. What give the viewers, the listeners, a sense of what it is actually like in one of these justice centers. What kind of work young people are doing there for their communities?
I think it was very interesting, and I talked afterwards with Hina about this. We were both impressed that we went first to a government-run, quite good professional access to services. You know, and the government felt they were doing a lot. And somehow the difference when it was a community-based, community-run, you know, we all sat in a circle, everybody was equal. You know, there was a wonderful woman, I've forgotten her name now, quite small, and she was a dynamo. And just, you know, and we felt that the community was empowered by this center. You know, by the fact that as of right, they were coming in with their problems and everybody was, you know, treated respectfully, listened to. You know, it was just, you know, it just showed the difference between a rather, you know, efficient but rather cold professional service to people who felt, I think, slightly, you know, they were the beneficiaries, but they weren't really being empowered. And I think that's why the people-centered justice is such an important, at the heart now of the task force, at the heart of the Justice Action Coalition, and at the heart of the Justice Appeal 2023.
That's great, thank you. And you're getting lots of kudos online for your answers. Val Barnes, 2001, who asked the previous question, comes back and goes, Mary really gets it. So I think that's strong endorsement from people out there. And do keep sending your questions in. It's really great to see them. But Shaneel, let's keep on this topic for a little bit longer. I mean, Mary's spoken about the struggle to provide justice within communities. She said that's often something that governments don't welcome. And I think I know from your work that you also think that sometimes governments have set up legal systems that are just fundamentally excluding people in one way. or another. How do we begin to tear down those structural barriers and begin to level the playing field so that people aren't, just shut out by design from the justice system?
On the original question about how we serve justice to people who are poor, New Zealand has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. New Zealand also has one of the highest re-offending rates in the world. So what we know about our prisons is that they are not working. We spend about $100,000 a year to keep one person in prison. Ironically, the taxpayers do not want to pay the same kind of money to protect people outside prisons. So this whole idea of building prisons and investing tons of money to keep people inside it, but having no willingness to give them money while they're outside, makes no sense to me. And what we know is that people who are poor are more likely to be imprisoned for little crimes like using drugs, using cannabis, smoking cannabis. In New Zealand, you can go to jail for that. And poor people who are often suffering from mental health problems, who often are forced to commit crimes to survive, are imprisoned for just trying to make it through life. So I would recommend that we need a fundamental shift in what we resource. Let's stop building more prisons and throwing people in there and putting money to keep them in there. And let's ensure that people do not have the need to commit crime in the first place.
Yeah, it's such an important...
I could just add, and worse still, are privatized prisons.
Yeah.
Because having prisoners means it's a more lucrative profession.
I remember speaking to a new Minister of Justice, and she'd just been to visit one of her prisons for the first time, and she found in there a mother with a baby who should have been released 6 months previously, was still in there, and she was shocked by that. And I said to her, "And you're paying taxpayers' money to keep her there." So I think this is really this shift of resources from what isn't working and what is perpetuating injustice to the people-centered justice is an incredibly important theme. We have a question here from William Gifford on Twitter, and I'm going to turn that over to you, Vino. William says, this discussion has touched on how youth can demand that the state upholds its responsibilities to ensure justice, but there's another side of the coin. Do the panelists see a role for youth in delivering justice beyond simply holding the state accountable? In other words, should we as young people rely on ourselves, not me, not as young people, on yourselves to deliver people-centered justice? So I gather William is young as well and wondering about his role as a provider of justice.
Mm-hmm. While young people can definitely contribute to attaining people-centered justice, I don't see the youth movement as being separate from the efforts from other sectors. I feel like we as a community need to work together for us to be able to get there. Because definitely young people can do a lot when it comes to raising awareness, engaging people at the grassroots, building movements even. But then at the same time, if we disconnect ourselves from other sectors who are doing the same work, that would be really more difficult to attain. So I definitely think that multi-sector collaboration, co-creation is important. As somebody who's really active in the open government partnership, that is the way to go for me. Just ensuring that while we work together, it is definitely inclusive and we see each other's contributions and build on those successes.
Okay, so give us a little bit more detail on that. You talk about open government partnership, which for people don't know is a massive partnership in many, many countries that works to try and open government up so it's more accessible to people. And their philosophy is around co-creation. What does that actually mean and what does that look like in practice? How do you co-create change in country?
Okay, so under the Open Government Partnership, especially in the Philippines, we create this action plan wherein governments and civil society organizations need to work together on a certain commitment. So my organization, Youth Alliance for Freedom of Information, we are advocating for the passage of a Right to Information Act, something that we don't have in the Philippines. So take, for example, the government counterpart does engagement within the government agencies just to make sure that we have more freedom of information, government champions within government, and then engage legislators in knowing more about how freedom of information law will benefit their constituencies. Meanwhile, us in civil society, we engage other civil society organizations and the general public just so we create the public clamor so that ordinary people will tell their legislators, we want a freedom of information law, make it happen. Otherwise, we're voting you out next elections.
Okay, that's great. And I'm going to come to you on this, Shaneel, because I've got a question from Elisa, and I don't think it's our Elisa, and she's asking how the Young Justice leaders plan to work with national and well, with young people both nationally and locally to continue to develop and implement your plans. How do you make sure that this isn't just a group of 7, but it's a group that is 7 million, 7 billion?
Yeah, 7 billion. Well, well, I can talk. Well, the thing is that we're 7 young people from different parts of the world. So you've got someone from the United States, and then you've got someone from New Zealand, and we're on the opposite ends of the globe. And so that already builds a partnership across the globe. So that's the first thing that we do as a group. But I think we all came into this group already having connections to our community. So I think a fundamental requirement to being a young justice leader was that you are connected to the people on the ground. So back home on my Instagram, I have 58,000 followers. And the way that I've gathered that is through working with young people on the ground. When I started the movement to ban conversion therapy, people started listening and they started reaching out. And for me, it was about ensuring that they believe in me to deliver that on behalf of them. And a part of getting them to trust me was working with them rather than for them. And I think a lot of the times people, elitist young people, are too invested in building a name for themselves and forget about the people that they are serving. And I think as young justice leaders, we always reminded that we have communities to serve and we always take back what we have here to them.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I mean, we've been on a fairly positive note, but let's look at some of the, the darker side. When we do live in incredibly difficult times, the world seems to barrel from one emergency to another emergency. And Mary, in your work, the climate crisis is, right deep into the critical zone. We have, red signals on peace. There are just food crisis that is, gathering pace, and then just this tidal wave of injustice in the world that is often bringing young people out onto the streets. We've got a question from Leah here on the Elders YouTube channel, and she says, with all this injustice in the world, what gives you hope in your justice work? And do you sometimes feel despair? Do you sometimes feel that it is actually hopeless?
Yeah, it was interesting when I was working as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I found that going out into the places where there was the most injustice gave me the most hope, because there were people struggling for that justice. And they were so courageous, they were so impressive, they were so inspirational. I would always come back to the office and people say to me, you've come back energized. And I was, genuinely. And I think that's very true, that, there are so many problems. I've just been in 2 places in Africa, in Rwanda and in South Africa for the Elders Board meeting, etc. And I was conscious, that you have a war in Ukraine, but the impacts are being felt so acutely, because there are the 3 Fs: food, fuel, and fertilizer. And it's just impacting. And, when we were in South Africa, President Ramaphosa told us that the COVID crisis caused 2 million people to lose their jobs in South Africa. And now those people are facing much higher food and fuel costs. And, it's driving them into an even worse poverty. And he called it the bystander issue. Bystanders to this terrible war, the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, but actually the impacts and, the need to open up the Odessa port and open up that grain and I think is very acute. So, we have a series of crises now that countries are facing, and it's quite destabilizing. There is the climate crisis, and it is, the window is, really closing in a way that we're going to have to step up dramatically. But you then had the COVID crisis with the inequitable access to vaccines, the lack of global partnership governance. And then you have the now inflation, food and fuel and fertilizer prices. So I think we're in a very difficult time in our world, which the elders are acutely conscious of. And, it's going to be harder because, of the Security Council being blocked because of the veto by Russia, etc. And indeed support from other members of the Security Council. But I feel that the hope is that we have a very young world and we have young people all over the world. And I really feel that the elders, in wanting to do all of our work very intergenerationally, which we sort of made even clearer in our strategy going forward, whether we work on nuclear, whether we work on climate, on these existential threats, we want to work intergenerationally. Justice, we want to work intergenerationally for the very good reason that this is the much more powerful way of trying to address very, very real problems, and a world that is much, much more difficult than it was when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights.
And Vino, let me turn this to you. I mean, your base and your work has been in the Philippines, but increasingly you're working in countries across the region, many of which have been battered by this wave of crisis that we feel. How do you keep hope? How do you find a light in these dark times? And what is your response to the crisis in the countries that you're working with?
So in the Philippines, we have this term called bayanihan. So basically that is having this sense of community wherein if you see your neighbor having less food or scarcity in food and you have an extra, you give it to them. So that is how we're coping. Definitely helping relatives or other members of the community get by. But then at the same time, this is not a sustainable solution. So definitely there needs to be further discussion on how to address this, especially in the global south, wherein I have workmates working in Sri Lanka who are really suffering at the moment. So while it is from the grassroots, it seems like we're kind of helpless and we're just getting by helping each other. I think there needs to be some clamor to assert some concrete action, not just from governments, but also across groups like, for example, in the ASEAN.
Let me turn this to you, Shaneel. And if you could just actually focus on the people who are working to provide justice. How do we care for them? How do we sustain them? How do we keep them fresh, keep them able to deliver the promise?
Well, the climate crisis from where I come from is quite bleak. I was born in Fiji, and a lot of the villages have been relocated because our land is no longer livable. Places like the United States and the UK, they're not going to feel the climate crisis until we in the Pacific are completely gone. In Aotearoa, we have this concept of kaitiakitanga, and that means that we have a duty to care for the environment. In Indigenous populations, there's no such thing as owning the land because we are a part of the land. Any harm that is done to our land is done to us. So every earthquake, every tsunami, every natural disaster is a cry for the earth to connect with Indigenous peoples. And I think that what gives me hope is that young Indigenous people, and you may have worked with many of them, is that they in the Pacific are leading the action for climate action. And it's just really bleak when you see your people who are not being granted the right to move as refugees to other land die out in lands that are dying. So it's bleak, and I guess for young Pacific people who are just constantly fighting at the front lines, there is very little time to sit around and talk about hope. We just got to get to it.
And Mary?
I needed to come back in because as chair of the elders, if I didn't, quote what I've learned from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he was being accused of being an optimist a few years ago on a panel, and he said, "Oh no, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And that resonated hugely with me at the time because it means that you have the energy to take the next step that has to be taken, whatever it is. And then talking, both of you, about Ubuntu, the whole spirit of Ubuntu, which also continues to inspire us as elders. And actually, there's an equivalent in my own country, Ireland. It's the spirit of Mehel, which I'd hate to tell you how it's spelt. You wouldn't believe it. But and it's again, it's something that I recognized when I was campaigning to become president of Ireland, because I could see Ireland was benefiting from the agricultural policy of the European Union, but the towns around and the countryside didn't have the facilities. So communities were coming together for facilities for young people, for the elderly, and it was exactly that. And now in a downturn, that comes out again. But I wanted to also pick up on the self-care. I think this is incredibly important. Young people have suffered greatly because of a climate anxiety, and now COVID has had huge, dramatic, negative impacts on mental health that we still don't fully understand. And I think we need to know that people like you two and other you three, you're working, and you can get exhausted, you can get burnt out. You have to, and that's why your point about even having resources is important, because that helps, but also to have other things that help to distract you, whether it's music, whether it's walking in the forest, whether it's doing yoga or meditation, whatever it is, to always be conscious of your self-care, especially when you're working in tough environments.
I think this is really, really important and powerful advice. I wanted to, we're beginning to move towards the end of this session. Mary's mentioned a few times this appeal for 2023, this call from the justice community that's assembled here in The Hague, really to step up on justice for all as we reach the halfway point of the SDGs. I want to go to each of our panelists and ask for one hope, one wish, one commitment for 2023. What is it, Vino, that you think that you want to help make happen in this critical year that we're heading towards?
Well, definitely inclusion of more children and youth at the discussions. So we're just two, Shaneel and I were just two representatives, but I think there are more in Asia, in the Pacific, and in other parts of the world who want to be part of that conversation. So maybe the next year we will also spend our time listening to their narratives, their perspectives, and their ideas on how children and the youth can contribute to this agenda, because I definitely think we can definitely get creative, and maybe we can surprise you with fresh ideas.
And Shaneel, I mean, you're coming off this success on banning conversion therapy, and I know from our chat yesterday that you're beginning to think about what comes next. What do you think you hope to achieve in 2023 through the young justice leaders?
New Zealand is one of 5 countries in the entire world that have a national ban on gay and gender conversion therapy, which leaves places like even the Netherlands not in that list. And I think leaders all around the country need to start talking about the fundamental rights of queer people. But I also wanted to send a very quick message to young people around the world. Scare the status quo. We're not going to get our rights by being nice to people. For a very long time, the status quo has used standards of civility to cancel anyone who retaliates against them. We need less civility and more chaos against the status quo.
It was the slogan of the Next Generation Fellows in their report for the Secretary General. It's not our job to agree with you, which I thought was just such a great line. Mary, time for the young people to challenge the status quo, but what's the breakthrough that you're hoping for in 2023?
Because I remember the difficulty of agreeing Goal 16, I would like those governments that have been giving leadership so far to actually begin to gather in more governments. We need more governments to be part of this Justice Appeal 2023 because ultimately, justice is the responsibility of governments. Yes, I'm a great supporter of the open government movement and have taken part in quite a lot of discussions. And I love the links with different aspects of society and in particular civil society organizations. But ultimately, there is a responsibility, and not enough governments are being, encouraged into that responsibility. So I would like to see, a significant increase in the number of governments that join the Justice Appeal 2023. And I think it's the responsibility of those governments that already joined to take it upon themselves to widen the circle.
And how do you think this intergenerational conversation can be continued? How would you urge young people to work with the elders to take their aspirations forward?
I think the approach is absolutely right. Not necessarily to agree, but to be truth to power and to be representative as you are. That's what is so valuable in the intergenerational conversation. And I think, having a good intergenerational conversation in the justice area is vital, because young people, are, so disproportionately affected as our young, as our women and girls, as we know. So, I think also, young people drive an agenda well. So I'm, more confident that we will fill some of those gaps, that we will make a difference if we have, as we have now, this young justice leaders who are clearly going to, I don't know whether chaos is the right word. I mean, I'm not sure now, but certainly, I think interrupt. Make sure you're there. Make waves. That's it.
So this is a time for making waves. This is a time of opportunity in 2023. It's now coming to the end of the session. As moderator, my main job is not to finish too late, too beyond our schedule. I think we've had an amazing conversation here today. I'm really delighted to see the Young Justice Leaders formally launch as a group, having been a witness to that first conversation when the idea came up of forming the group. I think it's got massive potential within the context of the Justice Action Coalition. I'm so pleased to see the Young Justice Leaders and the elders working together and standing true to that spirit of intergenerational dialogue. And I'd particularly like to thank Mary as chair of the elders for taking time out of a packed travel schedule to come and talk to the Young Justice Leaders today. Thank you so much to Shaneel and to Vino and to Lisa, who I know will still be listening online, for your leadership in making this group happen. And to Pathfinders, the elders, the World Justice Project, all the other partners who've made this event possible. If you're listening online, please do rally, please do get in touch. Please do, if you're young, please do get in touch with the Young Justice Leaders. Think about the SDG Summit in September 2023 and make sure that is a breakthrough and transformational moment for justice. That's the end of the session. Thank you all very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. Goodbye.